Okay. Okay. All right. So we have Michelle Mondo today, folks, for the PIAI Wednesday webinar. Um, Michelle is an intriguing person. I'm really excited for this one. She used to be a criminal justice reporter and writer and is now a licensed private investigator out of Texas. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about this story today, but the kind of the banner story that I first heard when I heard of you, Michelle, was the exoneration of the four women who eventually became known as the San Antonio Four. They were wrongfully convicted in a fairly high-profile case, I think, and you got involved somehow to dig up the details that got them exonerated in the end. So that's an exciting story. That's really cool. Wrongful convictions are very interesting and difficult cases, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the story and whatever else you have to share with us today. Thanks for being here.
Hey, well, thanks for having me. Should I share my screen now?
Yeah, you can go ahead and get started. And just a reminder to everybody, go ahead and mute yourselves. Questions in the chat if you have something, and we'll pass those along as Michelle goes. Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
Is it, there we go. Doo-doo-doo. There. Is that working for you guys?
Yep, I can see it. There you are, full screen. Looks good.
Awesome. Okay. So yes, my name is Michelle Mondo. I now own Mondo Investigations here in San Antonio, Texas. I used to work for, as a journalist for a long time here in San Antonio. I worked for the San Antonio Express News, and I became a cops beat reporter, crime reporter. I covered breaking news. Eventually, I covered death penalty and executions, which are kind of a regular beat here in Texas because we execute so many people. And so in doing that, I used to say, it's crassly, but that's, crime reporting. I used to say, from the time the first body drops to the last body drops, I covered the system the whole way through. And one of the things that once you start covering executions, especially, you get a lot of jail mail from people. Everybody sort of through the system sort of ends up knowing you. And you get to know your appellate folks really well. And for me, it was the Bexar County District Attorney's Office. I guess I should say for my bio, I did quit journalism. I went into content marketing, which is what I do now. We were talking about that earlier. And I decided I was kind of bored, and an old homicide buddy of mine was like, you should be investigating things. So I got my PI license. I've done a whole variety of things since then. I picked up a job as a research producer for an A&E show called it's one of those real generic ones. Witness to Murder, Digital Evidence. I had 3 episodes on that. That was a cool sort of break transition between working for a newspaper and having my own PI business, because it's sort of all open records and finding people and stuff like that. And now I do a lot of political opposition, anything involving open records, OSINT. I do talks on open records. That's how I met Sally. She came to one of my post cons for the Texas Association hours, each different on different open records. And so that's me. And so today, when y'all approached me, like I said, usually I do open records, and I sort of do these really actionable kind of presentations where everything's linked and you can click on things and you can go do all of the things. And but I didn't really have the time to learn all about Idaho, and I think you guys already have experts in that, so you didn't really need me. So as mentioned, maybe talk about the San Antonio Four. I obviously did this as a reporter, not a PI. I am jumping into criminal defense work now, though. So a lot of what I learned, I sort of relate to the criminal defense world. The San Antonio Four, this is a quote from Liz, and these are the 4 women. Knowing open records, I got their old mugs, and those mug shots ended up going everywhere, and I don't know if they were annoyed about that, but they sort of ended up sort of all over the place. So these are their mugs from when they were first arrested. They were arrested back in the mid 90s. And the case is one where by the time I got started on it in 2009, the case was done. Their appeals were done. They lost them all. No one was really talking about it. I did not know about it. I did not grow up in San Antonio. I'm from Ohio. I moved to San Antonio in 2002. Um, so it was all done. And what happened was it showed up in a Texas Monthly, which is a a state magazine that has a lot of true crime. It showed up in that magazine. A man from Alaska, of all places, came across the case, started communicating with Elizabeth. He believed in their innocence. He wrote like this wee little thing in Texas Monthly. My editor handed it to one reporter. He didn't want to do it. It got sat on my desk. And so I picked it up from there in 2009. So that's sort of this part. The case was really interesting in that they were all four friends. The nieces of Elizabeth is the one who did that. They accused the women of sexually assaulting them during a week-long trip. Um, it was a really bizarre accusation where, you know, in this week where the girls were hanging out with the women, and the women at that time were between the ages of 18 and 22. So Liz and her friends, they were pretty young. And the girls had said, you know, out of the blue one day, Liz called them into the apartment and they just started, they were all sort of having what I could only describe as this lesbian orgy. And then they just attacked them and did all these horrible things to them. Um, and then the vacation just continued and then they dropped them off. The women heard about the accusations that the trip where they stayed with the women at Liz's apartment was in, I think, July. They heard about the accusations in maybe September and then they were indicted. Um, Interestingly, Elizabeth had her own trial and then they tried the other three later together. I think they just decided, why are we doing them all separately? We can group them all together. What made that really interesting looking back in terms of an innocence investigation, when I show you the questions I was looking to answer, it's rare that you get two opportunities to compare. So I could see like, okay, this is how Elizabeth's trial went. She got 37 and a half years. And this is how the other three, this is how their trial went, and they got 15. And so what's sort of the difference? And that was something I could look at. Um, so Anna, Cassie, and Christy entered prison in 2000. And by the time they were able to get out of prison, that was when Liz would have been able to get parole. Liz had such a harsh sentence. I was really interested in sort of also finding out why. The map we have here that I put up, one of the things was there are a ton of pictures out there. I don't own them. The Express News and other news organizations own them, so I tried to be kind of limited in that. Especially since I'm going to be trying to write a book, I just wanted to be careful about how much I'm putting out there that I really should have to pay for. So this is a map of where the women were in prison when I first did the interviews with them. You know, I did it over a marathon, couple of days. I used to do that for executions, drive 5 hours for the interview, do my hour interview and drive 5 hours back. But it shows sort of like in innocence cases, especially when you have a state the size of Texas, how incredibly expansive and expensive they get, which is why, you know, not many attorneys take them on, not many PIs can take them on, because where's the money going to come from? So let's see. So when I decided to get started and it sat on my desk, it's like, okay, I'm going to go interview the women. They all talked to me. And then I realized, how do I start this investigation? And I did, you know, it started with a review of documents. Anna's uncle had most of the original documents, which was really lucky for me because open records laws in Texas are good, but you do not get sex assault records. Like those are automatic, they are exempt and you will not get them. The AG will not release them. You know, those are locked down really tight. So they can even sort of find exemptions for trial transcripts sometimes if they're, minors and sex assault. So I was able to get all the trial transcripts. I was able to get those were released to me through open records. The original statements were incredibly important because it could show the pattern of sort of what the girls started with and then where we ended up. And so having this sort of full look at the case, from the time it started in 1994 till the time it ended in, 2000 with the appeals being lost. I had a whole bunch of documents. And one of the things that became really important to me were the divorce records. So the father of the girls who accused the women, his name is Javier Limon, and he was Elizabeth's brother-in-law. And one of the things that the women told me, and that two of the women told police at the time, was that Javier said he was going to get back at Elizabeth because she was dating a girl and he didn't like it. And it was sort of these sort of statements that when you're investigating, you're thinking, oh, well, we'll see, you have to, you look into it, but does, a lot of people say that, or I'm going to get you, so it's like, what could you really show? And what I found was like in all of my for this criminal case, so much of my information came from civil documents. And I think in Idaho, I looked it up and your divorce records aren't public, I don't think. In Texas, ours are. So I could just go to the various courthouses and get all of the divorce records. My records came through, the Texas Public Information Act, which is the equivalent of your Idaho Transparency Act. And I looked up that I-court thing for Idaho. That's sort of like what my version in Texas, what I used to sort of track him through the system. And so that became his civil cases became super important to this criminal case. So in my review of documents, this is before, you have all the fancy software that can link people and do all the fun things. And I have a picture at the end that shows the huge stack of documents. I had so many and I was trying to keep it all straight. And so I created these, that's the picture. I created these really tall, they're like easel size sheets that you could stick. And I could stick them around my room or I could stick them at my office and I'd have all of these facts. I did it for the 4 women. I did it for the accusations. I did it to track all the inconsistencies. I did it for a timeline. And it's how I sort of, because when you're dealing with 4 defendants and they were all in different places, they were all different ages, it sort of just helped me keep it in my head, right? And so that was part of the review of documents. As I said, eventually, this was 18 months of my life. Most of it was done at home and on the weekend. And I started carrying everything around in a big wheelie suitcase. So I would just take it to the office and bring it home because so much was done on my own time. I don't think I'd do that again. I wouldn't do it on my own time again. That is the folly of youth. So after doing a huge review of the documents and interviewing the 4 women and reading stories, back issues, which we didn't have quite as many as I thought we'd do. For my investigation, these were the questions I needed to answer. What role did Javier play, if any, since he was the one that the girls mentioned, or the women mentioned? Did he have any previous accusations? The women did say that they thought he had done this before, but they also, there was talk of this boy in Denver when they lived in Denver, and that boy had done something to the 2 little girls that accused the women. And everyone used this boy as sort of a scapegoat. Like, okay, well, there's the science that says these scars or that these marks on these girls are scars. And so what happened in the trials is the lawyers used this boy in Denver as saying, well, he could have done it, right? And so that was sort of a really big question I had to answer. And that came into play with the divorce records. What were the inconsistencies? What was the science behind the scars? I started hearing that the science behind it was already debunked before it went to trial, which, if that was the case, was pretty crazy to me. And then all of the four women, Liz, Anna, Cassie, and Christy, they're all lesbians. And here in San Antonio in the 1990s, a very Roman Catholic, Mexican American neighborhood that they grew up in, it was hard. It was hard for them. And there was a lot of anti-gay bias in San Antonio at the time. So I wanted to see if that was an issue. And I have these little I have my little, okay. Javier. Javier was a really interesting, I always call him a character, which seems weird, but this was a story. This, now I call him a subject, but he was a really interesting character to me. When you would talk to men about Javier, he was very different. You get a very different vibe than when you talk to women. Javier was very good at finding vulnerable women in vulnerable situations, marrying them, taking care of the kids they already had, and then having more kids. Javier had kids, just all over the place. Javier became a Jehovah's Witness at one point, and his home life was very structured, very insulated. He didn't talk to many people outside the family once he became a Jehovah's Witness. So this is where the divorce, again, like all of those civil records, I could have done all of this with interviews, and a lot of this I shored up with interviews. But so much of this came from my civil record searches. So Javier and Rosemary, these were the accusations involving my case. Rosemary was living in Colorado. The first accusation involved the boy that, and what I found out about that boy, because all the women were like, this boy, you need to find the boy. No one could find the boy. And what I found out, there was no boy. There was never a boy. The boy didn't exist. And I found that out because I tracked down the man who lived with Rosemary and Javier at the time. And he was very honest, and he said, oh, he's like, yeah, I heard that. I heard that those kids said that they were, raped in my house, and there was some boy hanging around. He's like, there were never any boys here. None of us have boys. The only kids who lived here were Rosemary's kids. And I said, oh, well, that's weird. And he said, nah, that's Javier. And I said, what do you mean that's Javier? And he said, well, that's just what he did. Back in the day, like they grew up together on the west side of San Antonio. And he's like, he had kids young, and he was always telling us, excuse my language, but fuck with me, I'll get my kids to fuck with you. And he said, he's like, he was always getting his kids, to say weird stuff about people. And I was like, that's crazy. And I was like, okay. So I went to the Denver police. They worked with me on trying to find anything related to an outcry in this Denver house. And what's interesting is the Denver accusation was actually made in San Antonio in divorce court. So Javier took Rosemary to divorce court in San Antonio. And that is the first time he made an accusation. And it was made about a boy in Denver who didn't even exist. Rosemary lost custody of the kids, and they went to live with Javier. Then we have Javier and Angela, and Javier and Karina. And these are other divorce cases that all involved some sort of accusation of abuse, whether it was made from Javier's mom, Serafina, who made a lot of accusations. And it followed this pattern I could see from Denver to three different cities in Texas, where every time Javier needed control over a woman, he took her to civil court for something. And these accusations rarely made it to police. There are two times they made it to police. One was with my women, the San Antonio Four, and the other was in this case involving Javier and Karina. And I'm going to show you something a little later with those accusations with that family. Every single kid was making accusations against every other kid. It was a mess. And what's interesting is that was when this was all happening during my reporting. So I was watching it sort of, I was driving to Houston to sort of cover these divorce because it's open here in Texas. If you show up to divorce court and it's a civil case, it's just like any other case you can go watch. And so I would just go to these hearings for him. That is the other time it made it to police, and Karina's oldest son, who is not related, well, yeah, it would have been a half brother. He ended up taking a plea. So he took a plea to stay out of prison because he saw what happened to the other women in this case. And so he was afraid. Um, so when we get into the accusations, this is where the divorce records were so important. They also led me to new interviews, including Joseph. Joseph was further removed from everything, and he also provided a lot of insight into what it was like to live in Javier's house. Um, to get that interview, I found his family, and I got this like mysterious call from someone, and I had to go meet them, out in this rural area in the woods. And, some guy comes out and he's wearing basically a bike, a leather, like the type that the the bike motorcycle clubs wear. And he's like, "Why are you asking about Javier? We don't have anything to do with him. We don't want him around us." And I said, "Oh, I'm investigating this case, and whether or not these women are innocent." And he said, "So you're not hired by Javier?" And I said, "No, no, no, I'm not related. I have nothing to do with Javier. I'm looking into whether or not he made this up." So he said, "Okay, I'll connect you with Angela and Joseph." And then we went through this other really bizarre set of instructions that led me to a park. And in the park the picnic table was Angela and Joseph. So, but it was interesting to me that this guy who was somehow related to Angela, a cousin, a brother, it's unclear, they were so protective of Joseph and Angela that they had their motorcycle club buddies sort of circling the wagons. And that also told me something about Javier, and sort of, Angela was so afraid of him. The men didn't seem afraid of him, but they were doing that to protect their relative and Joseph, because Joseph had run away from Javier's house, and they thought Javier would come and, try and kidnap him back. Um,
Michelle,
uh-huh.
this is amazing. Um, would now be a good time to pause and just see if anybody has any like questions to
Sure.
catch up on the character sheet here? I think I
Yes,
probably
yes.
have a couple if nobody else does.
Okay, go ahead.
Anybody
Sorry.
got anything that need, no, 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 that's okay. This is obviously a really big branching story with a ton of, and I like that you called them characters because it is like that. It's like the characters in a very big mystery novel. Keeping track. Okay, go ahead. Yep.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Hi, Chris Swan. Um, you may answer this already, but did you get any pushback? I'm assuming, you get any pushback from law enforcement or others during your preliminary investigation? And if so, how did you handle that as an investigator?
So, by the time I did this case, I have been a cops reporter for a few years. The DA's office, because of my connection to you know, especially the executions and doing those stories, the execution stories were pretty in depth, and learning, because I had to learn that part of the system, I was on the phone a lot with the prosecutor that handled them. And so because of that, he knew me and he trusted me. So when I said I was doing this story, and again, he was far removed. This was in the mid 90s, so he wasn't there. Um, he and the DA had a "we'll wait and see" attitude about it. I did have a judge that also knew me and handed over the trial transcripts because the court was going to charge me an absolutely astronomical amount of money. And they can do that under open records. I didn't think it was fair. And I was sort of moaning to this judge about it. And he's like, just come to my office. And then he handed me some CDs. He didn't do anything illegal. They were public documents. It's just sort of helping me around that bureaucracy. The cops were interesting because the chief of police at the time, he was not the chief of police then. He didn't really have a dog in the fight, but he really doesn't like me still. He didn't like me then. He doesn't like me now. I was well known among the rank and file. I had a ton of sources in the police department, all different kinds. And so they weren't unhelpful, but I knew that the original detective in the case, his name was Butch, or his name is Butch, Thomas Butch Macheka. I knew through, my various sources that he wanted to talk to me. And, because he knew I was looking at this case as, when I talk about the anti-gay bias, he wanted to talk to me about this case. They wouldn't let him. And so there was that sort of top down, the chief was like, absolutely not. I knew I had heard that Butch wanted to talk to me, but he wasn't allowed. Interestingly, I ended up being a victim in an invasive visual photography case here in Texas, where I stayed at an Airbnb with my friends, and the host was videoing all of us in the shower, in the bedrooms, and everywhere. The person who got that case was Butch. He's still around. He's just in a smaller sheriff's office. And it was really awkward. And, he was like, he's like, look, Michelle, I'm sorry. I don't know how to say this, but I've had to review a bunch of video, and I did not see you in it. I think I would have recognized you. And I was like, yes, this is very awkward. I appreciate that for you letting me know. And then I just said, hey, by the way, unconnected, I'm working on a book about this case. Would you be willing to talk to me now? And he said, yeah, I would, because I wanted to talk to you before and defend myself, but I didn't get to. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And so I think when it comes to reporters doing these innocence cases, so much is dependent on whether the cops and prosecutors especially will stand in your way. So in Texas, we had a case involving a man named Michael Morton, which ended up creating the Michael Morton Act. And the prosecutor dug in their heels on that case. And they fought journalists, they fought the Innocence Project, they fought and fought and fought. And for me, in particular, Rico Valdez, but also the DA's office, really just took a wait and see attitude towards me. And to see how it was, they just stayed out of my way. Didn't help, didn't harm. They just wanted to see what would happen.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Appreciate that.
Michelle, I just have a really basic question. How many alleged victims were there? Those little girls, how many were there?
Sorry, just two. The two nieces. So in the large family tree, you had, of the San Antonio the four women, you had Elizabeth, Anna, Cassie, and Christy. Those were the four friends. The two little girls who made the accusations, those were Elizabeth's nieces, and they were 7 and 9 at the time. And their names are Vanessa and Stephanie. And so Liz was always taking care of them. They were always at her very small apartment. So them being there was nothing abnormal. What was weird is that these accusations came up when they did. Because Elizabeth had lived with Javier and Rosemary, which ended up being part of the story because he was constantly hitting on her. When she was 15 years old, he's an adult male married to her sister. And he was saying, come with me. And he's just, he's a creepy dude. And Vanessa is, as far as I know, still, she lives one street away from Javier. She's very entangled with him, as is Stephanie. But Stephanie ended up on the opposite side of his accusations. Javier made accusations that Stephanie's kids were being abused. and he tried to get custody of them. It's really strange. He was just sort of, it was like collecting children like you would like little Pokemons, you know? He was just out there like trying to collect children. It was very weird, very bizarre.
Wow. Little girls' names once again, just so I can keep them straight.
Stephanie and Vanessa.
Stephanie and Vanessa. Okay, thanks.
And the other odd part about Javier is that he often he never was the one making the outcry. It was usually his mother. So in this, he had this way of using the system to his advantage, but staying outside of it. And the only time he ended up forced to testify was in the case against between him and his daughter, where he accused Stephanie of abusing her kids when he was trying to get them taken away from her. But through all of it, he never testified in any of the trials. He wasn't called, which everyone thought was suspicious. And part of that is because it was his mom who made the original outcry to police, saying my girls, or, you know, my granddaughters were playing with Barbies in a weird way, and they say that their aunt hurt them or something. And so Javier, he was just really, really good at using the system to his advantage, is what I found. Any
Okay.
other questions?
And I don't see anything in the chat. There's a comment from Allison Asher saying that I specialize in sex crimes, and the story I read off the bat doesn't make sense. But other than that, I don't see any questions coming up. Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I mean, that is one thing for the person who mentioned that about sex crimes. So as a crime reporter, one of the things I did was I would go to, I'll skip to the next slide so you don't have to drive. One of the things I would do is I would go to our magistrate where everybody was in jail, and I would look through and see what the crimes were and see if there was a murder or anything I needed to cover. Usually what we would have to do, we would collect all the affidavits on the ag sex assaults of kids. And the reason we did that is we didn't cover those if they were familial. We covered them when it was public and may involve, sorry, my cat, and may have involved like a principal or a teacher. We only covered sex crimes involving kids and women, frankly, if it was a public facing threat. But what that meant is I read a ton of arrest warrant affidavits involving child sex crimes. And the first thing I thought when I read the statement from the girls, I thought, you know, this is so weird. And it read like a porn that a man would make for other men involving women or lesbians. And I say that, and there's actually a documentary on this case called Southwest of Salem, and she followed me around forever. And that's like the only line that made it into the documentary was me saying this sounded like a porn. And the reason I said that is because a lot of people were focusing on sort of the Satanism aspect. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the science of the scars. And they're like, you know, this had this sort of occult thing. And I was like, you know, I think that's reading more into it. It reminded me of, you know, if you know those old movies like Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, stuff like that. And anytime you saw women in college, they would be topless and putting on their makeup, and they'd suddenly have a pillow fight. And you're like, what is this? Is so weird. And that's how it read to me. It didn't read to me like any other statement I had ever read. And that sort of stuck out to me. It was like, you know, I've read so many of these, and you sort of see these little patterns that come through. And this one was just so outlandish. Like, just as suddenly 4 women in the middle of the afternoon would just, okay, let's have sex with everyone. And then they'd take the girls into the bedroom. I mean, it was just bizarre. None of it made sense. So I'm glad there's somebody out there who said it doesn't seem really realistic. So part of the accusations, this was just part of this family. these kids, it was so hard keeping track of who was accusing whom of doing what in the newest iteration of the family. And these kids were all around. So the one was 8. And like I said, Vanessa and Stephanie were 7 and 9. These kids were around 6 to 8. And the accusations they were making against their fellow siblings were very similar to what Vanessa and Stephanie said about their aunts. It involved suddenly taking them into a room, closing a door, leaving one kid out and one kid in. The accusations always involved a shower. Like they had to go take a shower later. So there was always a shower involved in some way. Whether it was they made a victim take a shower or somebody else took a shower. Philip was the older one who was a half brother who took the plea. I have to say, this family, by the time we get to this point, this family was so weird. I don't know what was going on in that house. I don't know if Philip did something to those kids. Um, it was all a very, by that point, Javier had become so paranoid and isolated. And only hung out with certain people from his church. He would not let the kids, they were homeschooled. He wouldn't let them leave. Joseph told me he controlled them through food. He would lock up the kitchen cabinets and stuff like that. I was a little frustrated because one of the things people don't know about these investigations in newspapers is you have to go through lawyers. And so the Express News is owned by the Hearst Corporation. William Randolph Hearst, the guy with the castle and all that. They have very, very good lawyers. And every single sentence I had to prove with a document, an interview, or something why I said that sentence. So when it came to Joseph, he was making all these accusations that I believed and I wanted to put in, and they took almost all of it out because he never reported it to police, and there was not a secondary or third document. The only person saying it was Joseph. No one else would confirm it for me, so they took it all out. But he was one of the ones that sort of led me to believe, like, by the time Javier gets to Karina, the house was so dysfunctional that I don't think Javier ever touched the kids. And Joseph said the same thing. Joseph said Javier never sexually assaulted the kids, because that was an immediate question. Well, was Javier doing something to the kids? And Joseph said he didn't think anyone did anything to the kids sexually. It's just all the abuse that they endured was psychological, sometimes physical in the form of like hitting or shoving or throwing. But the food was a big thing, and he talked about that a lot. And the gaslighting that they went through that I thought was really important, and all of that got taken out because the lawyers were like, well, you only have one interview, we can't use it. I feel like after going through the Hearst corporate lawyer process that I'm ready for any trial court, because they were protecting the newspaper against getting sued. So there you go. These are my 2 pages. I had many more of the inconsistencies from, like I said, from the time the girls started in my review of documents until we get to the absolute last phase of them in court with the 3 women. Nothing matched ever. So this was this one where you see there were no weapons, then a knife, then 2 guns, or maybe just Ramirez had a gun. That's a line from my story, and to get that through from the lawyers, I had a huge stack of documents, because I had to show each place where the girls said no, there was no weapon. I had to show where they said there was a knife. I had to show where they said 2 guns, and then I had to show where they said who had the guns. And then that next sentence also came from my first story. They happened at night, in the morning at 2 p.m. when Full House was on. In the living room, in the bedroom. So every single fact in there, I had to show the lawyers that I had proof of where they said that. That's one of the reasons these stories can take a really long time, is because of the fact-checking process and how it goes. The Full House thing came out in trial when Vanessa was on the stand, and it's, you know, it was a real tough call for the lawyers on how hard to go at these little girls. They were little, you know, by the time she was testifying, she was still only 11 years old. She was really small. You know, the prosecutor had to tell her, like, you know, Vanessa, scoot up so we can hear you. Try to lean forward so you can talk into the mic. So just imagine, you know, this little girl testifying in this big, scary courtroom. And then you have the defense attorneys who have to argue with them. Like, that's a really hard line to walk. But one of the things she's, you know, in the second trial, at that point, they did have her statement and they had what she said at Elizabeth's trial. And so they were picking up on the inconsistencies too. But in, you know, in the second trial, they turned that boy in Denver that didn't exist. They were the ones that turned him into the scapegoat. And that was, okay, you have a forensic scientist, a pediatrician saying that marks that she found on the girl's hymen in the sex abuse examination, those are scars. She was emphatic, they are scars, and it's from trauma. So the attorneys had to deal with that. And the way they dealt with it was this other boy saying he must have done it or someone else must have done it. All of the women testified in their own defense. Anna had an alibi. She was at work when Full House was on. But it didn't matter because you have these two kids and you had Nancy Kellogg. Nancy Kellogg here in San Antonio and Bexar County was a real important force in the entire child sex abuse sort of atmosphere. In that world, she created some of the standards that were used and that were then taken up nationwide. She trained all of the same nurses. She worked very closely with Bexar County, which is the county where San Antonio is in. And after talking to my sources, what I heard that I absolutely could not put in the story, and I probably can't even get them to say for the book, was that she was a zealot and that she was a little bizarre. She was incredibly religious, but more importantly, she felt if a child ended up hurt physically, it was a parent's fault, no matter what. And then the other thing is if a child said something, they were not lying. So hearing that from sources who were police officers that I very much trusted, I was like, well, that's interesting. And then I had, you know, the Innocence Project was getting involved, and they're like, you know, we're going to start looking at these sources of this forensic science. So what I started doing was researching. I went on PubMed. This is literally what I searched. I started searching scars on hymen, all these things. And what I found were these types of studies that were showing that what Nancy Kellogg said in trial in 95, I think it was, and then, or wait, no, 96 and I think 97 had already been debunked. They were debunked by 1992. Another reason I was very suspicious of Nancy Kellogg is because the uncle who had all those documents, he had from the attorneys who originally tried the case, the poorly documented exam that Nancy Kellogg did. But one of the things she wrote on it was satanic related. And in the 80s and early 90s, you had this big, what was called the satanic panic that just swept through the nation, where, and a lot of gay people and a lot of daycare center folks were sort of swept up in this very bizarre panic and wrongfully convicted. And so getting this image of her, I started to be very concerned about, you know, by the time she went to trial, she should have known. I was thinking maybe the science changed after the women went into prison, but what I found was no, it was definitely debunked before she even testified, and no one looked into it. No one said, well, wait a minute, this isn't even, this shouldn't even be testified to. No one tried to get it kicked out. They just sort of took her word for it. And I wanted to give you guys something. So in this day and age, I know we already said we're somewhat a little worried about AI. My research into the forensic science took a really long time. And part of it was just finding the academics who would talk to me. No one wanted to speak against Nancy Kellogg, finding any nurse who would talk to me. But also just doing all that research into the studies took a while. In this day and age, if I were doing this today, and I did this just as a test, ChatGPT and these AI models are good for generic research. And so I just went ahead and I show you here a couple of prompts that I did. You're a researcher, you're doing an analysis of all the research, give me some studies. They came up with those two that you see. There's one I wanted it to name specifically, which is the one I said you didn't find any studies for scars on hymen from 1991. And then it came back with this one from 92. And that's the one I needed it to find. I was thinking it was 91, but it's 92. And so I think that if you're doing this type of research, that is one thing that AI is good for, because you're not putting in any personal identifying information that shouldn't go out with ChatGPT. You're not putting in a photo. You're not doing anything like that. It's I use this a lot for learning about open record laws in other states. I ask it to give me, every law related to open records, and it spits out all the laws I need. So that's one thing that could be helpful, along, of course, with the all of the software that does all the family trees that makes it easier instead of putting it on a giant sheet of paper like I did. So when I looked at, so the satanic panic thing had a big vein of, the one that sort of swept the country, that was very much based in anti-gay sentiment. It was something that, gays were coming out more, people were getting very scared. You had the HIV scare, all these things were happening and people were getting scared. Then you have the satanic panic. So I wanted to look at my fourth little prong here was, did anti-gay bias affect the trials or the case? And what I found in Liz's trial, and remember, Liz is the one who was who was tried on her own, and she got 37 and a half years. That is a lot. She was 23. She wouldn't have been out till she was like 60. It was a harsh sentence. When I looked at Liz's case, first of all, the prosecutor and the defense argued from the very beginning, and they argued over who could be on the jury, because the defense said no one with then they used the term homophobic. They said no one homophobic could be on the jury. And the prosecution argued against that, and the judge let them in. And the foreman of Liz's trial said that homosexuality is a sin, it is against God, and they'll all burn in hell. And he was the foreman. So then all throughout the trial, when I was reading the trial transcripts, I came across these phrases like altar of lust and sacrificial lamb. So the defense did get the satanic panic, or satanic related part quashed. They weren't allowed to say they thought it was satanic related. They didn't need to. You don't need a motive in child abuse cases. But that prosecutor really went hard on sort of this imagery of these innocent little girls being offered up in a sacrifice. Consequently, stuff I can't put in the book and stuff I couldn't put in this story. I had heard from people that he was kind of obsessed with this idea of sexual sacrifice, and that women often were sacrificed in these ways. His religion was sort of strangely into this thing that, he believed that Satanists were all over the place, and they were sacrificing women and doing all these things, which if they were, you'd find bodies somewhere, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. Liz's own lawyer, who she hired because he helped her in a traffic crash situation, he hadn't done any criminal work, He used, as I put, shockingly intimate questions about her sexual orientation. I mean, he was asking, do you like this being inserted? Do you like that? I mean, when I was shocked at the questions he asked. And I found an academic, because I was looking at this and I was like, as I'm learning the system, it's like, well, when does it, when does incompetency come into play? When does the defense attorney not doing their job come into play? And the academic told me, like, look, the only time that really works is if they don't do any defense and they don't have a strategy. He clearly had a strategy. The strategy was to disassociate lesbianism as an adult with wanting to rape little girls, because the prosecutor was really leaning on that. Well, you like having sex with women, so why not have sex with the little girl? So he was really leaning on that, and Liz's attorney was trying to separate it. And the academic said, like, that it was a terrible strategy, but it was a strategy. So you can't you can't get him for that. All of the women were asked about their lesbianism in the trials, all three. In the second trial with the three women, the prosecutor and the defense agreed on terms on how it would be presented, and they, during their voir dire, they did not accept anyone who sort of expressed any anti-gay bias. And I really think that is what led to the difference in the sentences, because the detective and Nancy Kellogg, they had the same testimony. The difference was in how this crime was presented. In the second trial, it was really presented as, what the kids said versus what the adults said, and you had an expert saying it happened. And I think that without that expert, I don't know if the other three would have been convicted. But for Liz's case, the 37.5 years versus the 15 years, I think a lot of that came down to the way they played up this idea of, you're a lesbian, so of course you're going to want to have sex with little girls. And then they stacked the jury with people who thought she should burn in hell anyway. Some of the terms, I'm going to talk to Butch about this. I think this was a product of the time. In Southwest of Salem, the documentary, she leaned really hard on SAPD going after them because they were gay. I didn't see it. And part of that is because I had a lot of sources who worked sex crimes at the time. Butch was a homicide detective. His friend was on sex crimes, and she had to take a sergeant's test, so he picked up some of her cases. He used stuff like the women admitted to being gay. That was a very 90s way of thinking about it, and I think it's important, whether you're doing as a PI or in this case a journalist, to understand the time frame that something happened. It's not very fair of me to put to sort of today's standards against a cop in the 90s who was using what were commonly held standards. So in this case, I didn't really feel comfortable saying, and I also had sources that I went back and I asked, I said, hey, Nancy Kellogg said this was satanic related. And the one guy was like, oh, we didn't listen to that shit. It doesn't matter. He goes, look, you don't, and he was the one who pointed it out first. Like, you don't need a motive for a child sex crime. It happened or it didn't, it's not a murder. So that didn't factor in for us. And I did ask him, I was like, do you think Butch would have gone after him harder because they were gay? And he goes, no, I don't, Butch doesn't care. And from what I knew of Butch, he didn't really care. So, the results we got, this was my first story, December 21st, right around Christmas time. Nice, nice conversation to have around the tree. When this came out, the DA's office called me the day of, actually. And they were like, they said, we did not find one hole. We are very concerned about this. They said, let the Innocence Project know we're willing to talk. And I said, I can't be your go-between. You talk to the Innocence Project. One of the things that happened over the course of this, from the time my story came out until 2013, was the prosecutors here in Bexar County and the Innocence Project worked with the state ledge on Senate Bill 344 that allowed for appeals based on forensic science being deemed outdated, also called the junk science bill. This is a really big deal because the women's appeals were done. They literally had no way to get back into court. Nothing I presented was new evidence at the time, especially because it really had been debunked earlier. So in order to get the women back into court, they needed a way to do it. And so they helped pass this law. It's a law I think is really important and one of the only reasons I'm trying to write a book. The other thing they did, this is a picture of my story. Again, I can take a picture of my newspaper that is my husband had framed for me and not get in trouble for copyright. The prosecutors did strike a deal with the Innocence Project to let the women out on their own recognizance as the case made it through the system. What was really, really scary for them, and I followed them through this process. I wrote a total of 14 stories. When Anna got out, she had a lot of problems getting a job because she got out before them and she was under sex offender restrictions and she couldn't get a job. And I wrote a story about that and somebody saw it and ended up giving her a job. And so I just followed them through this process. At this point, they took them off the sex offender. They didn't have to follow any of those rules. But what was really, really scary is if the Court of Criminal Appeals decided that they shouldn't be out, they would have to go back and finish their sentences. And that was really scary for them. And you know, Texas, you never know what they're going to do. And in 2016, they were declared innocent and exonerated. I wrote this for Texas Monthly because I was no longer at the paper. It took a lot. And being declared actually innocent in Texas, I'm not sure how it works in Idaho, but the term actual innocence is a legal term. And that is what allows you to say this crime never, like, we did not do this. Because a lot of people, if it's an innocence case, they might get out on some sort of technicality, and then the prosecutor may decide not to try. And that doesn't necessarily declare you innocent. By being declared actually innocent, they get to have the records expunged, which they did. I'm one of the only people left that has all these records. And they got money from the state. They can get their payment from the state because Texas is one of the states that has a law that pays you when they wrongfully incarcerate you. And I think that's it, except for my, oh no. Oh, I clicked, that's right. Okay, let me go over here. There we go. Before you get into this, does anybody have any questions? Where am I on time? I feel like I really, going over.
That's okay, Michelle. A few minutes over, a little bit over is fine. I'm just looking on the chat and it says, Resolve Investigation wants to know, is there a documentary on this case that you would recommend?
You know, Southwest of Salem is the only documentary, and it's fine. You have to learn when you're involved in a story and you write a story, you know, she really approached it from a different angle, that being the angle of there was rhetoric used against the police that I thought was a little overboard. So that's the only reason, you know, when you watch it, I think it has great interviews from the women. She was with us when they got out. And I think it's on Hulu now. It was on Hulu. It's called Southwest of Salem. It got a lot of awards. I would just, some of the interviews about the police, I just didn't find that to be true. I'm not saying it couldn't be true in other scenarios. San Antonio police, they have a woman problem in terms of sexism. They have a sexism problem. For a long time, they definitely had a homophobia problem. So I'm not trying to dismiss that. I just don't think it was as outsized in this case as it presents. I think the biggest issue in this case was the forensic science. And they made a deal, the prosecutors essentially made a deal with Nancy Kellogg where she was allowed, I shouldn't use the term allowed, that's not fair. She signed an affidavit that said that the science changed officially, and I think it was something like 2004. It was sometime in the 2000s. I asked the prosecutor why that happened, because I was like, guys, you saw that I found all these studies. And they're like, yeah, but officially, it was a body of Academy of Pediatrics. There was sort of a loophole. I don't have any evidence to back this up. I'm going to throw it out there. I think that happened as a way for her to save face and the prosecutor to get what he wanted to get these women out of jail. And I think that's what he had to do. My biggest issue with that is there has never been a reckoning for Nancy Kellogg. And she has testified in so many cases. There are others who said that she did the exact same thing to them. And I think there should have been a review. I think it would have been, there's no way it would have gotten through. It would have been too costly. It would have been too time consuming. There wouldn't have been, most of the cases would have been found to be true. I think that most cases, when you have this sort of sex abuse, child sex abuse, the kids aren't lying. But I just think that she was allowed to get away with a little more than she should have. And I think there was a lot more put on the police that should have been put on the police. So when you watch Southwest of Salem, which I, go watch, I think it's still on Hulu, it's the interviews with the women are really, really good. And then getting to see them get out. And at one point you'll see me wandering around like a zombie in the courthouse with one of those things that I'm holding up. Like I was so tired. That's one of the things I remember about this period in my life is I was just so tired.
Michelle, Chris said that the documentary is also on Prime Video.
Oh, okay, cool.
And Sally Tierney has two questions. Sally, did you want to ask those?
Yes, please. Thank you. That was so interesting, Michelle. You're always so interesting to me.
Thanks, Sally.
How much of an investigation did this traffic attorney do on behalf of, I think her name was Elizabeth?
None.
So in my small amount of experience as a criminal defense investigator, if the attorney doesn't do an investigation, that's grounds for ineffective counsel on appeal.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I asked I say none because I don't really know. He was dead by the time I did my story. There were a lot of people, there was a priest who was going to be a character witness for Anna. He was in a coma by the time I tracked him down. He had been hit by a car and was in a coma. So with Freddie, the attorney's name was Freddie. I didn't have those documents. I had documents from Anna's attorney. So I guess I shouldn't say, that's unfair of me. I shouldn't say none. But it appears it was very little.
I mean, whether he hired an investigator, right?
Oh, Liz didn't know. Liz wasn't sure. The books with unreliable narrators, I love those books. I would call Liz almost an unreliable narrator. She was so young. She was one of the younger ones, 19 when this first started. She was really traumatized by it all. She was so outgunned and outmanned, and she hadn't even finished high school. Liz was a really vulnerable person for this to happen to. She was poor.
Mm.
Um, she had no concept of the system. By the time her three friends went in, Anna, they had good attorneys, but even they didn't look into some of the stuff, like the science of it. They
Mhm.
just took Nancy Kellogg's word for it. So, and that I do think in this day and age that attorney would come under fire a lot more. In the 90s and 1995, I feel like I feel like in Texas, I don't know about other places. In Texas, you should just get a redo if you were tried in the 90s. It was
Mhm.
a mess, y'all. And in San Antonio in the 90s, there was this really really big spike in gang crime, and in particular um teenage gang crime. And it was a crazy time, and every court was just packed to the gills. So in this day and age, I think people would look at his defense, and I think they might be able to get ineffective assistance, or yeah, ineffective counsel. But in the 90s, I don't know. And that's sort of when you look back, like, I have to remember this happened in the 90s. This happened in 1994 and 1995. Like, it was a mess back then.
Can I ask one more question?
Uh-huh.
What about, have you ever considered doing a podcast on this specific case? And if you did, would you be able to say some of the things you're saying to us without, having to have four, not alibis, but proof of what you're saying for every
I
word?
am I am shopping around a book, and I went back and forth on the book because I don't know if I mean, the reason I'm not doing it self-published or doing my own podcast is because I just don't have the, shall we say, oomph to get it done. If I'll be like, oh, I'd rather work on this puzzle, or I'd rather watch The Simpsons, and then I just won't do it. The book I'm shopping around, I do want to say a lot of this, and I really want to go after Nancy Kellogg in the book, because I think that she has really gotten away with a lot. But the main reason I'm so focused on the book is because of this junk science law. It has only passed in a few states. And in the other states that it's passed is pretty weak. And at the time, when this did pass in 2013, a lot of advocates really thought that it would have a domino effect and it would pass in most states. It's a really important, simple law. It hasn't passed at the federal level. So, Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama. You're looking at every bite, they went all in on bite marks at one point. That's been debunked. I just feel like this law is so important. One of the things I put in the book proposal is it's a good crossover for podcast or movie.
Mhm.
I don't know if I really want to do a podcast. I would be on a podcast if somebody else wanted to produce it. I do research for podcasts, and they're kind of a lot of work. So, we shall
Yeah.
see. I have agents looking at my proposal. Traditional book publishing is a lot of, it's a maze, so we'll see. I don't have the money to really do self-publishing. Because I want it to be fact checked, and that I have to pay for, so I would pay for that out of an advance.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
So if there's nothing else, I did want to leave you with at least one thing you can use. Sally was at my post-con, so she saw the links I had before, so it's weird to just have something that you can't really use. I found that a lot of people don't know about this, but JavaScript is what runs most paywalls on newspapers and magazines. This isn't connected to this case at all. It's just a little new year, new tool. So I took screenshots, and you can see these little guys, right? The JS, and they're extensions. The one on the left is for Chrome. The one on the right is for Firefox. I usually use Firefox. These extensions, you just, download them. You do your little, it only works for desktop. Mobile, it doesn't work because it's different coding. But when you hit a paywall, just go to your extension, click disable, and it goes away. Now that doesn't work for Wall Street Journal. They're smarter, they know. So they know I'm not a coder, I don't know how it works, but they figured out if we put our paywall, if we code it as JavaScript, everyone can get around it, so they're smart. But if you go to removepaywall.com and put the Wall Street Journal link in that, that will also enable you to read Wall Street Journal, or it did last week. Wall Street Journal is the best at the paywalls. They're really good at it. And I think
pretty
that's it.
cool. I love it.
Here's my info. If anyone has any questions, if anyone ever needs anything in San Antonio, Texas, this is a picture of all my files. It's hard to see, but I'm 5'7". It goes up above my knees, and those are from the case. And that's not including all the electronic files I have.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That has just been an amazing story. Fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely.
Everyone, we will be putting this recording onto our YouTube channel. So if you want to go rewatch it, share it with somebody. Michelle, if you want to share it with somebody, it will be there. Usually it's up within about a half day or a day, depending. And I will let you know.
Okay.
You can find us, the channel I'm going to put in the chat, so you have that link. It's just at PIAI114, and here it is for everyone. We also, of course, have our presence on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our own website, so you can find us there and usually find the videos through that route if you want to. All right, Michelle, thanks again. Really
Thank you
appreciate
for
you.
having me.
Thank you, Michelle.